It is the Pastor's Heart and Dominic Steele, and thanks for joining us. And an episode today for those really in New South Wales or the eastern part of Australia. We are wrestling in this part of the world with how to respond to the, well, prospective lifting of government restrictions on the whole of society, but particularly on churches. For those of us under lockdown at the moment, the trigger here is the population reaching 70% of double vaccination, and then another trigger when we get to 80% double vaccination. Sydney Anglican Bishop Michael Stead is with me, and he's been getting lots of calls from my peers asking for advice. And Michael, the times we've talked about this before has been theology and the politics, but I just want to get nitty-gritty with you. What's the timeline? What's going to happen?
Well, the critical thing is to work out when the 70% and the 80% benchmarks we're going to hit. People are able to predict that with a high degree of precision, assuming that vaccination rates continue at the rate that they're going. But at the moment, it looks like we're going to hit the 70% trigger somewhere in just after the first week of October, probably around about the 8th of October.
Take us through the, we'll put the calendar, well, actually, what's this one we're going to put up on the screen now? What's this telling us?
Okay, so on the left-hand side, that's the ABC projections, and you'll see that the light green bar says 8 October for New South Wales and 19 October. That's the 70% and 80% threshold days. That is the day on which we should reach 70% and 80% vaccination.
And the Victorian ones? Because they're also quite significant for some people. Yeah, well, for the Victorians who were with us. Yeah.
That's right. So you see, Victoria is quite a bit further behind us. They don't hit 70% until the 18th of November and then 11th of December for 80%.
Right. Let's go to the next slide. And this is the Guardian website. And I found this really helpful.
That's right. So what they've done is that they've worked out both the optimistic and the pessimistic rates of second dose vaccinations.
So the ABC picked a day and the Guardian's given us a range.
That's right. The ABC has said just take the current rate and extrapolate it forward, 60,000 a day. The Guardian has said, OK, if we hit 90,000, which is pretty optimistic, I've got to say, we actually come in around about the 30th of September or the 1st of October or something like that. Best case scenario is if everybody got double jabbed really quickly for the next. That would be the earliest possible date. 11 October would be, if we slow it right down, that's to about 50,000 jabs a day, and that's about as low as it's been for a while. So it's going to be somewhere within that range, and that's what that slide is showing us. Okay,
so moving now onto the calendar, what's it looking like for the next 6 weeks in New South Wales?
Yeah. So for New South Wales, if we get to the 70% mark on the 8th of October,
which is the ABC date.
ABC date, and if it's not there, it'll probably be within 2 or 3 days of that either side, statistically. The next date then is actually the Monday after that. So the government has signalled that the Monday following the day on which we hit the 70%, that will be Freedom Day, Freedom Monday I'm calling it. And so that for us would be the Monday the 11th. And then for us in churches, that means that the Sunday following would be the first time we'd be able to gather. So the 18th of October is the first realistic date that we could possibly expect to be back in church under the 70% rules.
So 17th of October Sunday, and then we've got, and then 24th of October.
Correct.
It'd be 70%. And then using the same kind of calculations, what's the go for 80%?
Okay. If we hit those marks, then we're going to hit 80% around about the same time, which means the following Sunday will be the first day under 80%. So we should only have 2 Sundays where we're at 70%. And even if my numbers are wrong and we slow down a bit, it'll still only be 2 weeks between 70% and 80%. It could just be pushed back a week. But really, once we get to 70%, it doesn't take that much longer to get to 80%.
And I think we're looking at, given that it's only going to vary 1 or 2 days either side, we can, in terms of planning for churches, feel reasonably confident about the 17th, the 24th, and then the 80%, the 31st.
Correct.
Now, what's the advice? You're running, you and the other bishops of Sydney, and I'm imagining other denominations are doing the same things, running advice for local churches on what to do. So what's the advice you're giving people?
So the advice is to recognise that it's such a short gap between 70% and 80% that you don't want to spend a lot of resources and energy planning your processes around what will happen at 70%, because at 70% there are still some very significant barriers to doing church church as we would normally do it. So firstly, we definitely know that unvaccinated people won't be able to be present because the government said that they'll still be under lockdown orders. Secondly, we know that unvaccinated children will only be able to be present with their double vaccinated parents, which means you can't run kids ministry. The kids can't come in and then go out. They can only be present with their vaccinated parents.
Now, when you said that to me, I don't know, Thursday last week, I went, really? Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, so let me just, how have you come to that conclusion? Because that wasn't immediately obvious to me.
So in the government's announcement about what was going to happen at the 70% mark, they're very clear to say that children will be allowed to go to outdoor venues without restriction, but children will only be able to go to indoor venues with their double vaccinated parents. It's very clear, and it's hard to see them making a distinction between indoor venues in churches and indoor venues in pubs and clubs. But certainly that's the rules. It's very clear that that will be the case from that first Sunday back in church.
Okay, so I'm imagining there's a whole lot of people thinking, but what about, but what about, but what about? So let me ask you some of the but what abouts. I mean, we're sitting here in Village Church. There's a backyard there. What if we put 25 kids and 4 kids leaders in the backyard and put up a tarpaulin shade cloth? Would that be okay?
So, according to the public health order, they are allowed to be gathering outdoors, but they can't come in the building. So the parents would have to drop them off outside before they come into church because they can't be in the building except in the presence of their parents.
Right. Okay, so
it's possible.
I guess your advice is don't put too much energy into that thing because it's only for 2 weeks. But if we wanted to, we could have kids dropped off at the gate and taken to the outside area and sitting in that area with a shade cloth or whatever. And then parents come around and check in at the front. We'd have to obviously do proper, even for child safety, we'd have to do check-ins. Would we have to do some sort of COVID check-in as well for the kids?
You can't COVID check-in. Well, the kids don't have, they're not vaccinated, so you can't check their vaccination status. And the parents would probably check them in as part of the normal check-in process. Check-in
process for the building, even though they weren't actually allowed in the building.
Correct.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay. Teenagers, I think we're sitting at, 15% of teenagers are double vaccinated at the moment. It'd probably be up to 25%. But really, in terms of youth group, there's not enough double vaccinated for by the 17th of October. And so
that's right.
So youth activities are going to need to stay online at the 17th of October.
Correct.
Have you got a sense of, as you've talked to churches, of what people are planning to do on the 17th and the 24th of October then?
It's a mix, really. I think there are some churches who've decided that they won't go back on that first Sunday. They'll actually wait a couple of weeks, and so they're planning for a start at the end of October.
The 31st of October.
For the 31st. Other churches, I think, are planning what you'd have to describe as a soft launch. That is, we're getting a group of people back in the building, but we don't want to send the signal that this is normal church because we don't want to exclude those who can't be with us because they're not vaccinated or whatever. So they're making it very clear that this is just a preparatory getting ready for a re-entry in a few weeks' time.
And so I'm thinking that's the direction we're going to go in terms of having a soft launch, and particularly thinking our young adults, although there is a complexity in that the young adults have been the last to get vaccinated, and so there's only a smaller demographic of them that are able to come.
Correct.
But also some of the parents who can either leave their kids at home or adults who are child-free in the morning who are able to come on Sunday morning.
Yep.
And you're getting some churches planning to start with that group as a soft launch on the 17th.
At this stage, I think the majority are planning to delay the start until the 31st.
Right. It seems to me that whenever you start, it's going to be a little bit 2 steps forward, 1 step back, a bit lumpy, a bit messy. And so, it's going to be a lumpy start whenever you start, so you might as well get on with it.
It's an opportunity to try out your systems. And so if you're saying that's what we're doing, is that we're actually just doing a dry run to try out our new check-in systems and whatever else that we're required to do.
And I'm thinking win people's confidence that we've got the COVID safe procedures right and all that kind of thing. I haven't heard any chatter about COVID-safe plans coming back, but I'm imagining we'll have to resubmit place of worship COVID-safe plans, cafe and restaurant for morning tea, that kind of thing?
That's certainly the case. They have updated the places of worship COVID safety plan in the last couple of weeks, and they've added a whole new section on ventilation. So that's probably the new thing for people to be thinking about even now, is that because Delta is so much more transmissible by aerosol, the whole issue of trying to keep as much fresh air going through the building is more important than it was in the last round of lockdowns. And so now, as part of the COVID safety plan, you specifically have to say what steps you are taking in order to maintain adequate airflow. And so if it could be open the windows.
It's good at summer.
Yeah. So this is a good thing that we're coming into summer, and it could be there's a whole lot of churches who are investing in very large fans in the next little while. But that's one of the things that we need to be thinking about. The other thing that's new in the COVID safety plan already is a question about what steps are you taking to encourage your staff to be vaccinated. So an explicit thing that churches need to do is to say we are taking active steps to encourage our staff to be vaccinated.
Right. Staff or volunteers as well?
Staff in that context would extend to volunteers. So, and particularly where you've got
church workers, using that official definition of kind of a volunteer who is a church worker.
Correct. Yeah. And that is especially the case where it's involving ministry to children. So the reality is children are going to be, many children won't be able to be vaccinated for quite some time, under 6, for who knows for how long, 6 to 11, probably not until the first quarter of next year. So they remain a very vulnerable group of people. It's essential that the people who are doing ministry to children and young adults are themselves vaccinated to reduce the risk to the vulnerable.
So that's a new thing for me. Would you be advising someone like me that I check that they've got a vaccination certificate if they're in kids ministry for me, in the same way that I check they've got a working with children check? Are you going that strong?
Yeah. We're probably going to go that far. We're still working out our policies on this, but we think that the government will require it in the same way that it's required. Like you can't go into schools and do SRE unless you have been double vaccinated, because you go into an environment where there's a lot of unvaccinated kids. Same principle you'd think would hold for our kids ministry. So we're going to have to ask youth leaders or children's ministers who are not vaccinated to voluntarily stand down for a time until it's safe for them to go and continue that ministry.
And would you, we've just talked children's ministry.
Yep.
Would you be then going to welcoming teams, morning tea teams, dinner serving teams after evening church, those kind of things?
Again, it depends on the amount of contact that they're having, but certainly around food handling and even communion assistant handing out bread and wine at communion, that they're the kind of things where there is a greater degree of close physical contact, and therefore it would be prudent to have those ministries staffed by people who are double vaccinated.
I'm imagining some people watching us now who'd be thinking, you've sold out completely, giving the government control of the church. I don't think that. No. What's your take on that?
Okay, I want to push back strongly on that and say there's a world of difference between excluding people from church and asking them not to participate in certain kinds of ministries. So I'm very keen on saying we've got to find a way for people who are not vaccinated to be with us in church. We don't want to exclude people on the basis of their vaccination status. However, there are a whole range of things where we say, for the sake of the safety of others, you can't participate in that ministry. Working with children check is an obvious one. We're not selling out to the government by requiring our children's workers to have working with children's checks. We're saying this is a safety matter, and if you're not willing to do that, you can't participate in that ministry. So people can be here, they can come under the sound of the gospel, they can worship as part of our church community. We're not excluding them from that, but their choices about vaccination may well exclude them from some areas of service.
Right. Okay. Given that we're assuming the 70% thing is only going to go for 2 weeks, and that the 31st we're going to jump over to 80%, what's your intel about what's going to happen at 80%?
the government is keeping its card very close to its chest at the moment. So
except for John Barilaro.
Yes, except for John. So at the moment, we are in discussions with the government, but they're inviting us to give them proposals, but at the moment they're not signalling very much. It's clear that there will be a timeline of easing of restrictions, and it's going to be tied to certain thresholds. So we know it's going to be tied to as we hit certain percentages, and something will definitely happen at 80%, and something else will probably happen at 85%, and something else at 90% or something like that. And so there will be a staged return to normal life. What exactly happens at 80%? It's got to be better than what we've got at the moment, which is unvaccinated people are still under stay-at-home orders. The point is,
because at the 70%, it's not religious discrimination because people who are unvaccinated just have to stay at home.
Correct.
You know,
That's
whereas
right.
so it's got nothing to do. You can't go to a cinema, can't go to a cafe, can't go to a church. But at 80%, well, we don't know.
That's right. So the point at which ordinary citizens are able to go and enter into non-essential shopping ought to be the point at which they should be able to re-attend church. If I can walk into Commonwealth Bank and do my banking, and I don't have to check my vaccination status to do that, then church ought to be on the same basis. That's what we're arguing with the government. What that actually looks like, it may well be that there are still some distinctions that the government forces upon us at that stage. That is, they might say, well, you can have, yes, these people can come back to church, but you need to have a separate area so that we keep the vulnerable safe from those who are not yet vaccinated, for example.
Let's workshop some of those other possibilities. I mean, you and I were discussing, and it's a little hard to understand what the Victorians have actually done here. And so, why don't you give us the different I mean, we both scratched our head about this.
So Victoria released its COVID roadmap over the weekend. Quite helpfully, it actually spells out in some detail what will happen at 70% and 80%.
Much more detail than New South Wales.
Yep. Yeah. And quite specifically for religious services, it makes it clear that at 70%, it's only the vaccinated who are able to attend church. At 80%, what it literally says is a 150 people cap, subject to the 4 square metre rule if your building's not big enough. Indoors, or double that outdoor. 500 outdoors, 2 square metre. And then it says max 20 people. Vaccination status unconfirmed. There's 2 ways of reading that. One is, out of the 150 people indoors, you can have a maximum of 20 people who are not vaccinated. That's 13%, close enough. And that sounds about right, because what that's saying is we've got to keep the percentage of unvaccinated people down because they are statistically a higher rate of transmission risk. And so if we have less of them, we're keeping the whole herd safe, as it were. The alternative is if you choose not to enforce a vaccination status.
This is the alternative reading of it.
A much harder rule is you either exclude the unvaccinated and then you can have 150, or if you include any of the unvaccinated, then you can only have 20. That seems like a pretty harsh read of that, but that's one possible way of reading it. And right at this point in time, it's not clear.
Yeah. Well, as we were discussing this, we've got clever friends who are reading it both ways. And so... Yeah,
but I think the one helpful thing about it is that it does send the signal when the New South Wales government is thinking about it, is there's some possibility that unvaccinated people can attend church gatherings at 80%. And that's why I think when we get to 80%, which again, first Sunday could be 31st of October, we may be in a position where those who are not yet vaccinated are still able to be present with us in some way.
I'll tell you why I'm thinking I want to start earlier. I want to get my people together, as many of them as we can, so we're talking face to face about how to love the others when we get to 2 weeks later. Do you know, so that... because it's so much easier to sort out disagreements if we can actually talk to each other, and workshop ideas if we can talk to each other. And one would hope the New South Wales government would be more generous to people of faith than the Victorian government. And the New South Wales government of either party has had a history of being more generous to people of faith than the Victorian government.
Yeah, and they, as I said, they're certainly open to our input on this, so that we are in discussion with them. It's just at the moment they're still working it out, and for them it is about looking at the daily statistics, because it's about balancing up the risk of greater infection with the whole public safety concerns. I mean, that is the, I think, disturbing thing when you look at behind the Victorian roadmap. What they are saying is this modelling is based on an acceptable number of deaths, and it does mean by changing out of lockdown they'll have double the number of deaths between now and the end of the year. That's a pretty hard metric for the government to have to juggle, and so I don't envy what Kerry Chant and others are doing at the moment. They've got a tough job, and I want to cut them some slack, and that's why I think it's okay that they can take their time to come up with the right plan as the circumstances evolve. Just in the last couple of days, it does look like case numbers are trending down. If that continues to be the case, we should be more hopeful about what happens at 80%. If they rocket back up to 1,500 or 2,000 a day, yeah, it's probably going to be 85%, not 80% as the magic number.
You did a little bit of, you produced a little graphic on the maths of COVID and just imagining what life would be like in the auditorium with people vaccinated, unvaccinated. Just unpack that for me. Yeah. We'll put it up on the screen.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, the graphic, I can't take credit for. It actually comes from the Doherty report, which is what the government is relying on for all its modelling, and it's talking about the effectiveness of vaccines to both prevent you catching COVID and prevent you transmitting it to other people. And I think everybody realises vaccines are not the silver bullet. They will not stop you catching COVID, and they will not stop you transmitting it to other people. What they do is that they reduce the risk by at least 50%, maybe 60 to 80% of you catching it, and they reduce the risk of you transmitting it to others probably by 50%. That number's a little bit a bit rubbery. But where the real power of the vaccine is that it actually reduces the risk of hospitalisation, admission to intensive care and death, like by 80, 90%. And that's what the government is worried about. The reality is when they reduce these restrictions, people will catch COVID in churches, and not just in churches, they'll catch it everywhere in our society. But for the people...
The reality is there's going to be risk everywhere.
That's right, there's going to be risk everywhere.
Risk going to Bunnings, risk going to the shops, risk going to the cafe, risk going to church.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so there are people out there who are... worried about that situation, and we're hearing things in churches, people saying, I will not come back to church if there are any unvaccinated people there.
Yeah, tell me what your advice to me as a minister would be as I have that conversation with someone in the next fortnight. Because, I mean, I've got a couple of them in mind. So I think it's helping them to realise that that's not a reasonable response to the risk that is around us. If you suppose that in a group of 100 people, there's a percentage risk that somebody is going to be a carrier for COVID and they're going to pass it on to you, that's going to be there whether those people are vaccinated or unvaccinated. Yes, it may be double the risk if they're an unvaccinated person because they're twice as likely to catch COVID. Admittedly, though, vaccinated people are more likely to be asymptomatic, which means they're actually going to be infectious without realising it, and they can pass it on without even realising they're sick. So you can't say, I will only come back to church if there are vaccinated people, because you are still at risk from the vaccinated people in the church. In fact, if the church has 100 people and 90 are vaccinated and 10 are unvaccinated, statistically you are more likely to catch it from a vaccinated person than an unvaccinated person. I know it sounds counterintuitive. Each individual unvaccinated person is a higher risk, but there's a lot more of the vaccinated people at the lower risk. So we can't aim for a situation where there is no risk in coming to church. It's all about managing the risk of catching it in the first place and managing the risk of its impact on our own health. Which is why vaccination is so important, because it radically reduces the likelihood that you're going to end up in hospital or dead. Okay. That's a good line for me in terms of the person who says that side of the equation. Help me with the line for the person who's arguing the other case. I want my right to come to church and I want to remain unvaccinated, and it's not for a medical reason. And there's some pretty strong voices out there. I'm hearing in the Christian blogosphere and that kind of thing. What would your reply to those be?
I want to say to both groups of people, read Romans 14 twice, substituting the word eat meat with get vaccinated, and then do it again with not get vaccinated. And my point is, we have to change our mindset and actually think about, why am I doing what I'm doing? It's actually for the sake of the weaker brother or weaker sister in this case. And so the beauty of this argument is it works whatever you think the other person is, the weaker brother or the weaker sister. So if you do not want to be vaccinated and you think that people like me who've been vaccinated have done the wrong thing, I want you to think of me as the weaker brother and cut me some slack on that, and understand I might be fearful of catching COVID from you, and therefore as an act of love you would say, look, I voluntarily I'm going to step back from serving morning tea because I realise Michael's concerned that I might be a risk to him, and because I love him and I don't want him to be anxious about church, I will do that for his sake. That's what I want people, and the same thing works on the other side of the argument. You want the vaccinated people should not be looking down their nose at those anti-vaxxers and using that kind of rhetoric against them, actually saying, he or she is my brother or sister. For their sake, I want to find a way that we can come to church together, and I'm going to voluntarily let go of some of my fears about my own health and safety for the sake of us as the body of Christ. So I think the weaker brother-sister thing works both ways.
I like that. I mean, I've been planning a after-church town hall discussion Zoom meeting for this Sunday to talk through with my congregation our plans. I've been thinking how to frame it theologically, but you've actually given me a helpful clue to do that, and so that's been really helpful. Okay, you talked a moment ago about the auditorium itself and potential segregating of people and that kind of thing. Like I noticed, I'm pretty sure I read that some of the churches in the UK, they're getting people who are more sensitive to sit up the back and have bigger space between the chairs up the back or something like that. Have you got any kind of wisdom in this area, whether it's separate spaces or where you sit in the auditorium or anything like that?
Unless you've got a way of actually controlling the airflow itself around an auditorium, the auditorium ends up being just one big airspace. Unless you've got airflow that's pushing all the air across this way and out one big window, big fans this side, big windows that side, the reality is the air is going to circulate around, and as much as we might feel safer sitting in one corner, if you're sitting in the same room for an hour, this is the thing that they're discovering about the Delta, is that it seems to be much more transmissible airborne, and having people in the same space for an hour, breathing the same air that's not circulating, it actually doesn't make that much difference whether they're up the back or down the front. Yes, okay, if you're sitting right side by side with somebody, yes, it's worse, but the reality is just being in a separate area in one undifferentiated space is probably not going to make a lot of difference.
So, I mean, that would mean there's no particular difference between going to a show and going to church, going to a cinema and going to church, because both of them, the argument's been church is riskier than cinema because we talk to each other and we hug each other and those kind of things. But I think you're saying going forward, church is not riskier than the cinema.
No, singing in church makes it more risky than the cinema. So the aspiration of the COVID particles is greater than. So the reality is we won't be able to sing for a while.
On the no singing, I've assumed the no singing is no congregational singing, and that we're still able to have platform singers.
Correct.
That's your read as well?
That's been our working assumption, yes.
Right. When do you expect to get word on the 80%?
Probably in the next couple of weeks. So
it has to be got to be before the 31st of October.
But we're still 5 weeks out from that date at the moment. So I don't think the government is necessarily going to commit to things. I think they'll give us little hints. At the moment, the government is doing everything it can to incentivise vaccination. And so at one level, I don't think they want to be too prescriptive. They don't want to be too clear about what's going to happen. And
if they're going to be generous, they don't want to tell us they're going to be generous at this point, because they want to talk tough.
Well, it's a combination. It's talking tough and also reading the circumstances around us. And so until they're confident that we've actually reached a plateau point in transmission rates, I don't think they want to commit to too much.
I'm imagining you've looked over to the UK, because, I mean, they are running ahead of us, although it's a slightly different scenario. What's your observations from church life there and what we can learn for here?
The first thing to prepare ourselves for is that there is going to be an increase, not a decrease, in transmission. So we're going to have waves. So we think things are bad now at 1,000 cases a day. As they reduce restrictions, things are going to get worse, not better. They'll stabilise, and the government's going to try to keep it at a point where we're not overwhelmed in our ICU and hospital beds. But that's the reality. We're going to be living with the reality of people in our congregations catching COVID.
And it does seem as though there's going to be a moment where one of our churches is going to be the site of a super spreading moment.
Yep.
And it won't be the fault of the local leadership.
No,
they'll have done all the right things, but it just was going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's worth saying, because I know some wardens are very cautious about whether we should go back. Are they going to be legally liable? No, and the answer is, provided that they are complying with the public health orders, it'd be very difficult to see that they have not taken a reasonable. They've breached their duty of care to take all reasonable precautions. So provided they're doing what the government says, they're not going to be legally liable.
Final words of advice?
Keep on remembering that Jesus is sovereign over all of this, and as much as we have no idea what's going on, that Jesus is the Lord of history, and that his plan for his church is better than we can imagine.
Michael Stead, thanks very much for coming in. My guest on The Pastor's Heart, Dr. Michael Stead, the Bishop of South Sydney with the Anglican Church in Sydney. You've been with us on The Pastor's Heart, and we hope you'll join us next Tuesday afternoon.